I've never read a study where subjects, when they've increased their calories from protein alone and their resistance training, they have never gained body fat.
Dr. Bill Campbell, as someone that studies fat loss literally for a living, you're a fat loss scientist, what would you consider the most profound stimulator for fat loss for people in everyday life?
So the things that come right to mind are exercise. I look at protein as a lipolytic nutrient, caffeine. So those are the, again, in my world that I focus on. Of course, then you can get into like drugs, certain drugs, beta adrenergic agonists, like things like that. So,
Okay.
but in my world, protein, caffeine, exercise.
Wow, interesting to see. Like usually you see protein as like, okay, this is gonna, a hypertrophy tool, but actually as a lipolytic agent, actually as a fat loss tool. How have you come to find that?
I bring these creatine stick packs everywhere. There's no sugar in them. It's pure creatine sweetened with monk fruit. That's the patented, tried and true creatine monohydrate that's out there. And that is a 50% off discount link with those stick packs. So 100% sugar-free. They've got some awesome flavors. They've got a lemon lime flavor. They've got a berry flavor. They have an unflavored version if you want zero flavoring whatsoever. And the cool thing is, it makes it so I can just sip on it throughout the course of the day. I like that. I like the idea of sort of micro-dosing my creatine, so I'm not having larger boluses. The literature shows that when you load with large boluses, that's when you might have more of the water retention. So I like just sipping on it throughout the course of the day. So 50% off your first order with Create and their creatine stick packs. So that link is in the top line of the description underneath this video.
It's through research. So I remember specifically, I think it was around 2014, 2015, I read a study, Joey Antonio. Okay. He's a professor at Nova Southeastern. He gave resistance-trained males and females really high protein. It was like 3.3 grams per kg. He did another study where it was up to 4.4 grams per kg. So the highest protein intake recorded in the scientific literature that I've been able to find. And again, he did several studies around this. And in one of the studies, they had increased their calorie intake by several hundred, 500, 600, 700 calories more than baseline. And they did not gain any body fat. In one of his other studies, also increasing calories only from protein, and they lost body fat. And they increased their calories by several hundred calories. So I read, I'm reading these studies, and they weren't the best designed studies, but I'm like, I don't believe, this is hard for me to believe. I was taught, you increase your calories, you gain body fat. So here's some studies. So I did my own study in my lab in resistance-trained females, where we had one group, we randomized them. One group we said, you cannot eat more than 1.2 grams per kg. So do not go over this. The other group we said, you have to eat at least 2.4 grams per kg. And I'm very proud of this study. It was very well controlled. So all of the workouts were supervised in my lab. All of the subjects had to be resistance trained. If they couldn't, I think they had to deadlift like 1.25 times their body weight, or they couldn't enter the study. So we did some objective measures to make sure that they were at least demonstrating that they were likely resistance training. They all had a personal coach that would answer questions if they needed it on protein intake. And after the study was over, the high protein group gained more lean mass. Not surprising. That's how we view protein. But they lost a significant amount of body fat relative to baseline. So it didn't quite meet the threshold to be a statistically significant difference between the two groups, but they lost a significant amount of body fat relative to baseline levels. So now I'm like, okay, I had a hard time believing another lab's results. But now this is my lab, my study. We designed the study. It was one thing I know is my data, and I trust my data. And then I started being, a little more open-minded to this, and I found another study, and then another study. And these aren't just one-offs. We have, I think, I'd probably at this point, maybe 6 studies that I've identified, sometimes resistance training, sometimes not. I'll say this, here's a powerful statement. I've never read a study where subjects, when they've increased their calories from protein alone and their resistance training, they have never gained body fat. And I mean by hundreds of, my study was 250 extra calories per day from protein alone. The outcomes are one of 2 outcomes. They either do not gain body fat, or they lose body fat. And here's another study. The researchers, these were women I think average age, I think the age range was 50 to 80 years old. These were women who they had normal weight obesity, so average weight but lacking in lean mass. The only thing the researchers did was they randomized them. They said to one group, you're going to increase your protein. And it went from like 0.9 grams per kg to like 1.3. And the other group, they said, you're not going to change anything. So no exercise. And the group that only increased their protein gained significant amount of lean mass and lost significant amount of body fat compared to the other group. No exercise stimulus.
Wow. So, it's safe to say that having a protein shake is probably as close to a legit, probably the more effective fat burner, independent of caffeine, maybe.
Yeah, if that protein shake is only we have overfeeding studies where they gave a lot of protein, but when they have a lot of carbs and fat, I haven't. That data doesn't come out like I'm saying here. I've taken this as I work with people trying to lose body fat. Like if you struggle with hunger, my advice is if you're going to overeat on protein, because the outcomes are not as negative than if you're getting Takis.
Does the protein itself, excess protein itself, actually store as fat, or does it sort of reallocate where other macronutrients go? Because it's kind of hard for protein itself to turn to fat, right? It just maybe.
Yeah. I think so. Now, I do have a mechanistic study that I think it was isotopically labeled that clearly demonstrated excess protein can be deposited as body fat. So it can happen, but I've not seen this in actual applied human research. So it's almost like it's a nutrient partitioning agent where the calories are being shuttled more towards lean tissue, which again, muscle is protein, and protein is amino acids. So that makes sense. But the fat loss aspect is, I'll just say it's odd to me. But what am I supposed to do? Ignore these 5 or 6 studies in humans, one of them being from my lab?
Yeah, and it's not like it's just a hypertrophy thing or just a lean mass thing. It's like, obviously there's the other factors. There's the thermic effect of it. There's so many pieces, and perhaps there's things that we just don't know yet, right? Where protein is clearly a very interesting piece. And I think there's a physical limitation to a certain degree. So it's like kind of probably hard to overeat protein to the degree in which it would actually it itself. Like if you were to just give someone, let's just say something ridiculously low fat, like chicken breast, all day, every day, like it'd be pretty hard to overeat on chicken breast, like to the extreme in which the protein would actually turn to fat itself.
Yeah, I think so, yes.
Yeah. What about timing? And I want to dive into, I think it was that December 2023 study. What is it? I don't know if it was Nutrients. Where was it published? Talking about like the 100 grams in one serving.
Yes,
You and I were talking about that offline a little bit. There's some limitations to that study. There's some things that people should probably understand. But before we get into the nuance of that study, like, does the timing seem to matter? So if protein is lipolytic, if someone were to have a large bolus of protein, is it a more grandiose lipolytic effect? If someone were to just say, hey, I'm going to finish my workout and I'm going to have 100 grams of protein right now, or perhaps having it more evenly spread throughout the day, what have you seen to be ideal? Does it really matter? Is there a limitation there?
So if somebody were to tell me in terms of distributing throughout the day, if somebody were to tell me my primary goal is to build as much muscle as I can, then the strategy is, well, we want to make sure that you get your total daily protein intake. And if you get that all in one meal, okay, that's not ideal. But that study we're going to talk about next, that made me appreciate, well, it's not as bad of a decision as I used to think before reading that study. But we have other human data, one of them I think it was a study from Spain on male bodybuilders, where what the best strategy is to approximately equally distribute your total daily protein intake throughout the day. So whether that's 3, 4, 5 protein feedings, that is the best strategy to optimize muscle mass. Because I can also point to research that says when they didn't do that, if we skewed more protein to the night, which is what a typical Western diet does, they've not gained as much muscle. So that's the ideal if the goal is to build as much muscle as possible.
Interesting. Okay, so
and that's an applied long-term study, not a meal-to-meal.
That's true. And I don't think most people are looking necessarily, meal to meal, unless you're doing some extreme crash diet, in which case there's a lot of other factors there. So, okay, with this study that looked at 100 grams of protein in one sitting, I'll let you describe it, but I mean, in essence, it was 100 grams of protein one sitting. Found that it was just delayed absorption throughout the course of a 12-hour period after that.
Yes.
But what did this study teach you, but what were the limitations of the study? Because I don't want people to just think that they can just get away with doing that all the time.
Yeah, and I'm curious to what you thought. I want to also hear what you thought the limitations were, and I'm trying to think right now. And I covered this in my research review, and I always list limitations of the study, but maybe it'll come to me. But let me just say, I really love that study. It was the best acute protein study I've ever read because they traced every practical question I would ever have as a scientist. And I don't know how many times throughout my career I've been asked, hey, more than 30 grams is a waste. You don't eat more than 30 grams. And now I can say, well, here's the receipts. It's not true. So the study gave subjects 0 grams or 25 grams of protein or 100 grams of protein immediately after a resistance training workout. And what they did was they said they followed this through all of the steps that are important. Because when we eat protein, it doesn't all go to muscle. We have something called splanchnic sequestration, and then we have peripheral availability. So as somebody who wants to build muscle, I want all of the amino acids that I eat. I want it all going to my blood and all going to my muscles. But that's not what happens. What happens is our digestive system will absorb a lot of these amino acids when we eat protein. And again, that's called splanchnic sequestration. And by the way, as we get older, we've heard of the term anabolic resistance. This splanchnic sequestration increases so that when we eat protein, more of it is directed to the intestines, organs, and does not make it to the blood to go to our muscles. So that's one of the reasons why as we age, we need more protein to get the same anabolic benefit. So what they did was they traced the amino acids, and this was milk protein. They traced them and said, hey, this is how much got sequestered from the digestive system. This is how much made it into the peripheral circulation. And then the two other parts of this, and again, I love this study, they actually were able to tell us how many of the amino acids in terms of grams actually made it into the muscle. And just because they go to the muscle doesn't mean that that's building muscle. So now we have to have another measure, which is muscle protein synthesis. But you're only going to have muscle protein synthesis levels go up if you have amino acids make it to the muscle. So the 25-gram dose got, I think it was 4.5 grams of the 25 grams made it to the skeletal muscles. And I think that was an estimate of whole body muscle uptake. They only took biopsies from the vastus lateralis. So that's one of the limitations right now. They measured one muscle, and then I think they had to estimate what does this look like throughout the entire body. So it was 18% of the amino acids of the 25-gram dose made it to the muscles. The 100-gram dose, it was something like 13 and a half grams. Let's just say 13 grams out of the 100 made it to the end point of skeletal muscle. So 18% versus 13%. So we do have evidence, which this backs up what I've already known about protein. The more and more protein you take, the less and less of an anabolic benefit there is. Doesn't mean there's not more of an anabolic benefit, but there's a rate of diminishing returns.
There's a line there. And
yes.
The interesting thing about this study, though, is that it was, the researchers and the lead author had said it was, there might be no tolerable upper limit. It's like
yeah, that was a little clickbaity.
It was a little extreme, but it's you probably could go above 100, but I would be interested to see it actually, because if you go from 18 to 13% with a 75-gram delta between the two, and then perhaps that accelerates even if you get higher above 100, right? So it's like maybe if you start getting to 150, maybe then it's going to take a sharp drop down to 4%, right? And I would imagine at a certain degree, someone's relative amount of skeletal muscle mass would determine that too. There's a demand for it.
Yep. Did you think though that when I read that title, I was like,
it was clicky for sure.
Yeah, and I'm like, maybe I should be more clicky in my titles. Like that was like.
That brings up a whole different discussion for another day, but it's find it kind of funny that even now, if you're looking on PubMed, you can just see it. It's like you're getting a little bit. These titles are they're playing the game too. It's kind of funny.
I guess the culture filters to the nerdy scientists.
Yeah, exactly. But you asked me about the limitations.
What'd
the
you
study
think?
design, I don't think there was a lot of limitations, but I think the one thing that would just pop to mind is that where it opens up maybe additional questions is. When people look post-workout, they're not usually looking at milk protein. They're usually talking like whey protein, something. So that would be something that would be interesting, something that is rapid absorbing, because talk to Mike Israetel about it. He was like, I don't think that study's anything that amazing because it's of course it's just all it did is drip out digestion or absorption over the course of 12 hours. He's like, of course that's going to happen. He's like, people just don't usually give it an opportunity for that. I'm like, well, yes and no. I also feel as though post-workout, there's probably not a lot of people that are doing straight milk protein. Like most people post-workout, the questions that came up are, can I have a 100-gram whey protein shake? And I'm like, that's a little bit different because that
is different.
Maybe we're not going to hyper-absorb all of that in one sitting because if we are talking sustained release over the course of 12 hours, that would apply a little bit more if you're looking at an equal part or 25% whey and 75% casein or something like that. So there's a lot of people who say, well, this is nothing new. We know that casein digests slow. I'm like, okay, yes, but we're not talking just about digestibility here. We're talking about what is, I think the radioisotope there, right? It was all the way down to what, what's getting to the muscle. So it's less limitation on the study design and more about, how can we maybe add additional arms to this where it can silence some of the people that were still naysayers on it, because I'm with you. That was one of the best design studies I've probably ever seen. And so when people were kind of poking holes in it, I'm like, you're just grasping for straws a little bit here just to be have something to talk about. Because this is, as far as with what they were given, it was one of the best design studies I've ever seen. But I would say if I were to do it again, maybe add an arm with whey, maybe add an arm with meat, right? Let's see what happens in something that's a little slower digesting. I found it particularly interesting as someone that really enjoys, a lot of my brand talks about fasting, right? So it was very liberating for people that watch my channel because they're just like, oh, cool, I can do 2 meals a day and get my protein in. Because you've got people again, I love them to death. Peter Attia, Rhonda Patrick, we stopped fasting because we weren't able to get our protein needs met. Well, now we can.
That study was a big boost to time-restricted feeding, intermittent fasting. That is one of my takeaways from that study.
Yeah, definitely. It was liberating for me because for a long time I would think that I had this upper limit of realistically 50, 60 grams. It was probably where I would go on the top end for me in one sitting, particularly when I would break a fast after 24 hours or something. Mm-hmm. I'm like, okay, I am kind of limited. And then if I want to get other micronutrients in from other food, I'm really limited on just the amount of time that I can get food into my system in this short period of time. So I end up very undercaloried, underproteined, and consequently weak, right? So, and maybe even losing lean mass. So now it's like, okay, cool. I can break a fast. I can have a 50-gram whey protein shake, and then I'll follow that up with a bunch of ground beef, and I'll get myself to 125 grams. And then all I have to do is get, another 75 grams throughout the next few hours, and I'm kosher. I'm good.
Yep. And one thing I didn't get to it, and we're assuming, but there was a significant increase in muscle protein synthesis in the 100-gram versus the 25-gram. So 25-gram was like 30% higher than 0 grams of protein, and then the 100-gram was 20% higher than the 25-gram. So that's really what we have to. That's the end game of what we want to happen in the muscle. So
yeah, agreed. No, it was a cool study, and it's and I think from a fat loss perspective, maybe that wasn't looked at a whole lot, but we can see it from your experience and your research that, okay, well, this is cool, because if people can have like this concentrated bolus of protein post workout, that's probably going to have a nice effect on satiety for one.
Yep.
And then it's also going to, if there is this lipolytic effect from it, then perhaps that carries over for hours after that, which could be really cool.
Yeah, to me, it was an OMAD study in one sense. I remember that study was hard. I mean, I have a biochemistry background. That was a hard study to read. I remember digging into that one.
Yeah, no, it was cool though. Come back to just protein and fat loss, and actually, I do want to spend a little time on caffeine too, since we mentioned it. But I want to come back to the protein for a second. And this may be very elementary for you and for some people, but I want to take a minute to talk about the insulinogenic nature of protein, right? Because people think, especially with my audience coming from a little bit of a low-carb background, there's concern over, okay, well, protein spikes insulin. Is that going to impede fat loss in a certain way? But can you describe the sort of insulin and glucagon curve that kind of happens with protein versus maybe just carbs alone?
Yeah, so with whey protein, it is insulinogenic. When you consume whey protein, there is an insulin spike, and also a glucagon increase as well that we don't get with carbs. So carbs is insulin alone, not much of a movement of glucagon. Whey protein, just trying to remember some studies where I'm remembering the graphs, insulin increase and a glucagon increase. And one of the things, just as a side note here, the reason why whey protein is so anabolic is because it's not only anabolic to skeletal muscle, increasing muscle protein synthesis, but insulin is anti-catabolic. So that actually tends to lower muscle protein breakdown. So whey protein is a really cool, like a really good nutrient for everything muscle building. So did that answer the
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. I think people, and from my understanding, the reason that, so if you were to have carbohydrates alone, you have a spike in insulin, obviously you're going to have GLUT4 translocation, and you're going to have, the carbohydrates go into storage. And if I remember correctly, it's like if you were to have a protein shake, for example, and it was just an insulin spike that came with protein, your blood sugar would drop too much. So there needs to be a subsequent increase in glucagon to protect that, right? So it's like if everyone was concerned with the insulinogenic nature and whey protein as it stands, if they were concerned with it because it spikes insulin and didn't have an understanding of the glucagon piece, if whey protein worked like that, that would mean that you'd have an increase in insulin with no dietary carbohydrates coming in. That would be a problem, right?
Yeah, we would have a very low blood glucose level.
Yeah. So the glucagon is there to basically protect and make sure that your blood
Stable
glucose
blood
stays
glucose.
stable. So it's, in essence, it's like net neutral. You're just like, here's your curve. If you've got a line here with insulin, line here with glucagon, it's like if you were to just have carbs, it would go like this. But if you had protein, it's going like this.
Yeah.
Right? It's just net neutral. It's just at an elevated baseline.
Yep.
And I just needed to have a discussion with that because it comes up in the comments all the time. Like, okay, well, proteins, if insulin, impedes hormone sensitive lipase, then how come when we have protein, it's considered a fat loss tool?
Yeah. So my reaction to that is look at the studies we were talking about earlier. Focus on the actual, and then again, I think we all like mechanisms, but mechanisms exist for outcomes. So what did the outcome study tell us? Yeah. The outcomes, the outcome studies tell us adding protein causes fat loss in some situations. And I do want to go back to that for a moment. In those studies where they gave non-resistance training women extra protein and they lost body fat, that was a scenario where they were eating very low protein initially, and they brought it up to optimal, even less than optimal. So when you improve a suboptimal protein intake and you improve their protein, that is when we saw these. So the reason I want to say that is if somebody's already eating a gram per pound or 2.2 grams per kg and they hear me talking about this and they say, oh, I'm going to double, I'm going to go to 2.4, I don't have evidence to suggest that that's going to be a fat loss stimulus in that case. Most of these studies that I'm referring to in the sedentary population, they're eating 0.8, 0.9 and getting it up to 1.3, 1.6 in that area.
Yeah, which makes that's a significant difference for most people.
Yes.
If they're making that bump.
Yep.
If we pivot over to, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but caffeine is always interesting to me.
Oh, yeah,
because,
me too.
Caffeine obviously increases the lipolysis, but it's not necessarily, or is it? I mean, it necessarily increasing oxidation. I have seen some papers that there's like a subtle increase in oxidation too, but maybe that just comes from the downstream effect of moving more as a result of caffeine, right? Mm-hmm. How does caffeine directly and indirectly stimulate fat loss?
It's a beta adrenergic agonist, so it will bind to the adrenergic receptor. The beta adrenergic receptor, which causes the liberation of a lipolytic agent. And there's a lot of other mechanisms that I can't remember that I think are outside of the lipolytic effects. So what is the one? I don't know if you remember it. Just like we have also some sports performance, some energy feeling, like those are other mechanisms.
Got it.
But in terms of fat loss, because I've written about this a lot, I haven't published, but I've spent a lot of time on this. Caffeine does everything you want it to do to help with fat loss, but I wouldn't call it a powerful fat loss stimulus. Okay. So at a moderate level, it does everything. So I can go. The way that I teach this is I like to use the energy balance equation. So we have calories in. Well, what caffeine does on that is it's a slight appetite suppressant. So we have a few studies that I'm aware of where it's reduced calories, not by much, 5% when we have ad libitum situations. So it's a mild appetite suppressant. And by the way, there's plenty of studies that show it has no effect. But we also have a few that says it has a mild effect. I've never read a study where caffeine increases appetite. So when I read those studies, I tend to say, okay, it's always moving in one. If it moves in a direction, it's always moving in an appetite suppressing direction, modest. Then we have, we know it increases the lipolysis. As you said, it also increases beta oxidation. We know that when it's taken with food, it increases the thermic effect of food, or some people call this dietary-induced thermogenesis. So you take caffeine with food, you're going to burn more calories than if you didn't take caffeine. It also increases the exercise energy expenditure. So if you're going to exercise and you take caffeine, instead of burning 100 calories, you might burn 112 calories during that bout. The interesting thing, and this is coming from a 24-hour respiratory room study that I remember, the only thing caffeine didn't increase was NEAT, which to me, I'm like,
wow.
Yeah. Now, again, NEAT's hard to measure. It's very hard to measure. But it did everything, and I can share those studies with you, just maybe you come to a different conclusion. But that was the study. They took it with food. They did sleep metabolism. Obviously, they measured lipolysis. So everything but NEAT. And I'm thinking, if I take NEAT, I'm more fidget. So that surprised me. And maybe that was a one-off. But that is my memory of, right? Don't you think you fidget more when you take caffeine?
Were they in a metabolic ward?
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe that's just who knows? I mean, God, I would think you'd fidget more, but maybe the dose wasn't high enough to actually induce that. But I certainly am more apt to do things around the house and
Yeah.
be externally stimulated to do things that are more active. So I think in a real world situation, it probably does increase need.
That's a good point. Yeah, there's no towels to fold or trash to pick up in the metabolic ward.
It would also be interesting to see how much a wife plays into non-exercise. Like, take the trash out, fold the towels.
Yes.
When wife's home versus wife's not home, what's the male non-exercise activity thermogenesis? One question I've always had on caffeine though is if you are increasing lipolysis and you have this re-esterification, so to speak, does that change at all, or is it basically like, okay, if you consume caffeine, you have an additional liberation of fatty acids? It doesn't really change. I mean, the rate of oxidation is so small, you're still having kind of the same re-esterification, or does that modeling change at all?
Re-esterification levels are still high,
Okay.
but it also does increase beta oxidation as well, so the actual burning of fat.
Okay.
Some people have described caffeine as a nutrient partitioning agent, where you're burning all the calories you're burning more of them from your fat stores and less from carbohydrate stores.
Do you think that might have something? I mean, because there's probably a slight increase in resting heart rate too, right? So maybe is it negligible enough that it could just be with that, or is it more monumental than like a 3, 4, 5 increase BPM?
Well, interestingly, because I've done multiple studies, we just published a study. I think it was last week, and I'll tell you about it. It was caffeine. It's not. You'd be surprised how many studies where they've given subjects caffeine where heart rate is not increased. You'd be surprised. Yeah. Blood pressures almost always go up, systolic, even diastolic. But I was shocked because, and again, I think we've published 4 different studies on the acute effects of caffeine-containing thermogenic supplements. And I think in every one, heart rate stayed, and again, these weren't odd findings. But again, it goes against logic, right? I would think, I feel like my heart's beating a lot more, but not as much as what you would think.
Interesting. Yeah, it's much more, but probably get more nervous system stimulation than anything else. You're probably just more aware of it. And you're like, I feel like my heart's pounding out of my chest.
Yeah. So can I tell you about our study?
Yeah, heck yeah.
Literally hot off the press. So is caffeine a fat loss supplement? That's the question. So a couple years ago, we gave subjects what I'm calling a thermogenic fat loss supplement. So this is one of those common supplements that has caffeine and about 28 other ingredients that I think do nothing. I think if somebody's going to have an increase in metabolic rate, or if they're going to lose fat, if caffeine's in the ingredient list, I think it's the caffeine doing it. So we published this study years ago, giving subjects this thermogenic supplement. And like every other study where you give them caffeine, either caffeine alone or as part of a multi-ingredient supplement, metabolic rate increased 8% over hour 1, hour 2, hour 3. So our study joined the 100 other studies that clearly demonstrates when you give somebody caffeine, it increases their resting metabolic rate or post-supplementation metabolism. Happens every time. The question is, if you give somebody that supplement for day after day, week after week, month after month, does it actually result in fat loss? In theory, it should, right? Because if you increase somebody's metabolism 8% for 3 hours a day, and again, most of these studies stop at 3 hours, but it's still above baseline. So in theory, it should cause fat loss. But I was never able to, my opinion was, I think we have one study that said, hey, the body actually slows down metabolism during hours 7, 8, 9, 10, so it offsets this. I think there's one study that reported that. So what we did, we gave resistance-trained males the same supplement that we had already published where it increased resting metabolic rate. We gave them 1 serving per day, which was 200 milligrams of caffeine for the first 4 weeks of the study. And we increased it to 2 servings per day for the next 4 weeks. This is an 8-week study. Our subjects were resistance-trained males, and they worked out in my lab. So every workout supervised. And Big limitation was we told them, don't change your diet. So big limitation. We don't have documentation. At the end of the 8-week study, the caffeine group lost significantly more body fat. So again, I was surprised. I'm thinking, now, again, limitations. Did they eat less? Well, if they did, caffeine might have been responsible for that. So I would have liked to have had diet records to do this. It was I think it was 1.1% body fat, where the placebo group lost nothing. So the question is that worth the money? Is that worth whatever risk a supplement can have? And I'll say from my lab experience, when we put subjects on a 25% caloric deficit that are resistance training, they lose about 1% of body fat in a month. So this was much slower than that, half the rate of that. So to me, it's like, what does a bottle of this cost? You get 2 bottles, is it $60? So anyway,
True. Yeah.
caffeine caused fat loss, no question. Was it practically meaningful? Well, that's up for the reader to decide.
I'm wondering if the impact of fat loss from caffeine increases exponentially with exercise.
Yep.
So it's like okay, so caffeine with no exercise, this rate of fat loss. Caffeine with this level of exercise, this rate of fat loss at this level. So it's like,
Yep.
Yeah.
And we did have them take. They took it with breakfast or lunch the first 4 weeks, and then for the last 4 weeks they took it with breakfast and lunch. And workouts were after that. They didn't. I think our workouts for like noon to 8 is when I could have the lab staffed. So workouts were after the supplementation.
And after feeding, workouts were after feeding, or were they fasted state?
We didn't have meal records, but I'm fairly certain not fasted, because again, noon would have been the earliest they could have trained, and nobody passed out or anything, or not like they were acclimated. So I imagine not fasted.
Yeah, because that would be an interesting one to look at. Is like, okay, control caffeine fed workout, control caffeine fasted workout.
Yeah. Yep.
Like, okay, so like it's fasted workouts versus non-fasted workouts, net large outcome, negligible difference, right? Mm-hmm. At least not meaningful. It probably has a certain degree on someone's fat adaptation too, I would imagine. Who knows? And probably their diet before, the day before.
Yes.
So there's all these different factors. But I'm curious, it's like, okay, well, one thing is like, if you do train fasted, does caffeine increase that even a little bit above caffeine plus food, right? That would be an interesting one to look at.
Yeah, just in my head, I think yes.
Yeah.
But is it, like you're saying, is it enough to move the needle, or are our devices sensitive enough to detect that?
Yeah, and then like you said before though, but if you have caffeine with food, it's increasing the thermic effect of that food, so it doesn't net out, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm always personally, I love to train fasted. I feel better that way. Not to go down that rabbit hole. That's a whole different discussion, because I think at the end of the day, you just got to do what works for you when it comes to training.
Yeah.
But
do you ever supplement with caffeine in your fast during your?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
Yeah. Usually sip on green tea during my workout too. I'm
Okay.
a big fan of that. I feel like I'm getting kind of a constant stream of it. I'm not a big pre-workout guy. I don't like a huge bolus of it, although I do occasionally find myself. The energy drink kind of thing sometimes happens where it's like one or two bad nights of sleep. Like, especially if like I'm on a trip or something, I'll go like, okay, I can justify a little energy drink today. I'll drink like a quarter of it, and then I felt kind of good, And then next thing you know, then you're drinking a half of one. Then by the time I get to drinking a full can, this happens multiple times throughout the year. Then I'm like, okay, I need to stop. Cold turkey, go away from it. Cut out caffeine entirely. So it's always it's terrible. Anyway, Bill, where can everyone find you, man?
My Instagram is Bill Campbell, PhD. And on YouTube, it's also Bill Campbell, PhD.
Right on, man. Well, thanks for making the trek here.
Thank you.
Cool.